this is our first CRED webinar. And so just to say, I'm Tessa Wright and I'm one of the CRED co-directors, and Elena Doldor here, you might be able to see her waving, who is the other co-director of CRED. So just a couple of words about CRED. We are around 24 academic members of staff and about 30 PhD students from a range of disciplines, specialising in many different aspects of equality, diversity and inclusion. One of the features of our research centre is not only engagement with other academics and academic debates, which we do extensively, but also a commitment that our research has an impact beyond academia to reach those working for EDI issues in organisations and workplaces. So one of the reasons for holding today's event is to bring together new academic research with insights from practitioners. So like many of you, I'm sure, as the pandemic evolved this year, we had many questions about the equality impacts it would have. So for example, the disproportionate impact on Black and ethnic minority people has been widely reported, although there's still more to understand about the causes of these differences. And lots of attention to the impact of school closures on working parents, particularly mothers, of course. So we started a blog series to examine these questions, questions such as who the key workers actually were during the pandemic, how it's affecting those with caring responsibilities, lessons for leadership in relation to managing the way out of the pandemic, and also looking at disabled workers and BME students' experiences. And these blogs are available on the CRED pages on the SBN website. So we're interested now in some of the longer term effects of the changes in work as a result of the COVID pandemic, which is why we've brought together today an excellent range of speakers to discuss whether the shift to home working and perhaps other forms of flexible working can offer some benefits, for example, greater flexibility for working parents to balance work and home, or provide greater opportunities for disabled workers, or whether these benefits are actually outweighed by the risks, for example, women taking on additional caring responsibilities, the impact on mental health and challenges for staff management, workload and performance monitoring that may adversely affect some groups more than others. So just before I introduce our first speaker, I would like to thank Alicia George, our events manager, for a huge amount of work on organising and coordinating and promoting this event and keeping us on track today. So thank you very much, Alicia. We couldn't have done this without you. So our speakers, I'll just let you know how the session is going to run today. We will have Suki first from Queen Mary, then we will have Claire from the CIPD, then we will have so they will speak for about 15 minutes each, and then we'll have a Q&A session after both of those two. We'll have our other two speakers, Abigail and Natasha, and followed by another Q&A session. So we're sort of breaking it up in that particular way. And I will introduce each speaker before each of them speaks. So just to say a little bit about Suki, who works here in CRED in Queen Mary, and her work is themed around exclusion from and marginalisation within the accounting profession. She's undertaken historical studies on race and class-based exclusion from the accounting profession and contemporary work on gender-based marginalisation within the profession. More recently, she's been studying changes in the audit model arising from enforced home working, with a particular focus on how this impacts on equality. Her works mainly utilise interview-based methods, and she's also led some international focus groups. Before she was an academic, she was a professional accountant and has worked as an external auditor. So Suki, please tell us about your very new and fresh research findings.
Thank you. I'm just going to try and share my screen with you now, if that's all right.
Oh, I'll stop sharing mine. Yep.
Please. Thank you. Okay, is this being shared? Yes.
Nearly.
Okay, so thank you, Tessa. The remit that Tessa gave me today was to share with you some of the findings from my study that I've been carrying out over the summer, looking at audit and home working. Oops. Okay. So in March 2020, as Tessa said, the government set out instructions that we should all lock down as a result of the pandemic. Most employees had very little notice before they were directed to work from home. Most accounting firms sent out notices to people saying, please take your laptops with you just in case you end up working from home. So I was quite interested. I have a number of friends who are still auditors, and I was quite interested as to how audit work could possibly be conducted, if it could be in fact from home, and what could we learn from this period of enforced home working. For most accounting students, we told them that an audit is an examination of the financial reports of an organisation by someone independent of that organisation, the auditor. They're normally qualified professional accountants. They work often at a client's premises, and what they do is they conduct audit tests on the financial systems of the company in order to gather evidence for the audit report that they will produce. So, without going into the technicalities of audit work itself, I wanted to share with you some of the characteristics of audit work, which include obviously travelling to the client's premises. Auditors tend to work really long hours. You're often dealing with tight deadlines. You're dealing with unpredictable workflow. You have to be available to clients for face-to-face meetings, for questions as part of your investigation. You have responsibilities to clients. You are reporting to your seniors and also juniors who are being mentored and taught whilst they're on the job. The way an audit normally works, an external audit, is you will have the juniors, the seniors, the managers, and perhaps even the partners all sitting in one audit room at the client's premises, all able to chat to each other, do their work, ask questions, and have direct access to the client all the time. The work is pressured, and although auditors and accountants are often perceived as being quite boring individuals, actually it's quite a social, there are quite a lot of social elements to the job, and work-related events outside working hours are perfectly normal. The thing that's really key here is the need to be present at the workplace. So how could a job that involves these kinds of characteristics be conducted from the home rather than in the workplace? Well, audit is an industry that hasn't offered much work-related flexibility at all. Home working was pretty much unheard of. Very few of the participants that I talked to in this project worked from home prior to March 2020. The work builds on my own work on returnships, where I interviewed women who had left the profession to raise families and then wanted to take career breaks and then come back into the profession. Obviously, managing their family commitments with the kind of pressure that is experienced in audit work is often or was considered by many to be incompatible. So I was interested in how the audit model might change as a result of this experience of working from home. I was in touch with 4 big accounting firms, and all of them were part of this study. I undertook interviews with various participants ranging from junior staff, managers, directors, partners, and even national audit leads to get more of a strategic view of what they were thinking about how home working could impact the audit model in the future. I conducted all the interviews between March and May 2020, so in the middle of the very first lockdown in the country, and all of the participants were home working, and I can tell you they were all delighted to chat to somebody outside of their immediate 4 walls. So normally, as I said, an auditor would be in an audit room at the client's premises with almost constant access to client staff, asking questions, examining documents. So during lockdown, while they were home working, how did auditors actually connect with clients? Was it possible to replicate that kind of connection that you might get in an audit room? Well, large audit firms have secure SharePoints where documents can be securely uploaded for auditors to access. Some of the junior staff that I interviewed said things like, well, you know what, when I'm sitting in an audit room, I'm normally there with my laptop downloading documents anyway. And so all I had to do was transfer myself to my bedroom to do it. Many of the participants we talked to had meetings with clients through Teams, Zoom, etc., that we're all used to now. There was a lot of screen sharing of documents. Daily lockdown meetings helped to maintain the direct connect with the client. Obviously not exactly replicating what you might have in an audit room, but still some sort of connection. So during lockdown, could auditors connect with clients? Well, the answer is yes. So the next question we thought about was, is it even possible to perform the audit while home working? Well, most of our participants said virtually all of the tasks could be performed remotely, including walkthrough tests. Perhaps the only exceptions really were the physical stock take, but without getting too technical about it, even some firms even managed to get around that. So the message that I was getting was removing the auditor from the client's premises or the office didn't have a significant impact on actually performing excuse me, the audit function in terms of gathering evidence. And there were some nice quotes from some of our participants. Is it possible to undertake audit work remotely? Well, Constantine says, we've proved over the last 6 weeks or so that there's so much you can do remotely. And Ansel, who says, I don't think being physically on site is as necessary as had previously been thought by some. So the successful move to remote audit does seem to have presented audit firms with a number of new opportunities that many of them possibly hadn't even thought about before. Certainly, higher levels of home working remove the limitations of geographical boundaries, and firms can select audit teams from much further afield. Many firms were already doing that to some extent, so they might have had specialist centres in certain parts of the country, which would connect with other offices. But certainly, geographical boundaries are removed. Higher levels of home working also have an impact on widening the talent pool for audit firms, which in itself has implications for equality, diversity, and inclusion, which the firms obviously already have initiatives on. Increased home working can help them to provide a better work balance, provide a better work-home balance for all employees. It could help them to accommodate the needs of working mothers, carers, or disabled workers. Another opportunity that has arisen that perhaps firms hadn't thought of before was the reduction in travel. Working from home means that auditors are not traveling to the clients all the time or the office, and that also has associated environmental impacts. And finally, providing opportunities for firms to reconsider their needs for office space. Many firms, for example, Deloitte's, are already getting rid of some of the office space that they have in city centres. The thing that I was really interested in, though, was opportunities for inclusion. And it's interesting, I talked to one female partner, Lord, and she said, well, actually, we are very open to recruit people with all sorts of different needs, which of course is the firm's standard line. But one thing she did comment on was the fact that she hoped that this move towards home working, this idea that it's far more acceptable, well, actually, people might reconsider whether or not they could be suitable candidates for this kind of a job. Certainly all the participants that we talked to wanted to work from home much more, particularly those with family responsibilities. And Lincoln, right at the end, said, well, everyone gets into habits. You just have to be on site for this amount of time. It has to be these people going to this particular client. Well, now we've shown that we can do it from home. It just doesn't matter where people physically are. Alongside all the opportunities, there are also some really big challenges, though, for working at home for large audit firms. Because the interviews were conducted in March, April, May, many of them said that the real thing that they were worried about regarding people working at home was actually whether the technology could cope with the amplified workload. And of course it did. Another key problem was the coaching of junior staff. Normally, junior staff, as I said, would be sitting in an audit room, having help from their seniors, learning on the job. It's very difficult to do when you've got your junior sitting at home and the seniors and the managers sitting separately from them. Equally important is the process of socialization, which occurs in the audit room at the client's premises. That's not something that can happen through home working. The partners that I interviewed were particularly concerned about the well-being of staff working at home, particularly staff who were living alone, particularly staff who had inappropriate workspaces. And during the first lockdown, people who had homeschooling, that really was an issue. And I think I can attest to that myself, because it was, I'd hate to use the word nightmare, but it was not great. Many partners also talked about the mental health and the motivation of staff working in isolation for long periods of time. And almost every single person that I talked to said that they missed the social interactions of the workplace. So again, a few quotes, just to highlight some of the words. The equipment was a problem. For example, Constantine says, I didn't have a proper chair, I didn't have a desk, I didn't have a spare screen. She'd set up her workstation on the dining room during the beginning of the day, and then at the end of the day, clear it all away. Samson commented, he was a young man, a young auditor living by himself in a single bedroom flat. And he commented on the isolation that he felt, even though he was constantly having meetings with everyone. Zahir talked about the social aspects of the job. Everyone said that they really missed it. And then, of course, Baldwin picked up on the homeschooling aspect of it, and right at the end saying, frankly, having a miserable time, which probably reflects it for some people. So when we asked, do you think that clients would be receptive to auditors home working in the future? Is the model about to change? Black, who was a partner at one of the large firms, said, yes, absolutely. I think some of them would prefer it. And of course, clients might prefer it because they end up paying auditors to travel. They pay auditors fees. They pay auditors to stay in nice hotels. So it actually could have an impact financially for clients as well. Is more home working a future model for audit? Well, the answer might be yes. However, there are certain aspects of the job that require a building of rapport with people, and that might be more difficult, as pointed out in the second quote there. But Black, again, who's a partner for one of the large firms, had said, actually, we need to think about it very differently. And a lot of partners are doing that now, a lot of firms are doing that. Now, perhaps the starting point is that you work from home, and then we bring people into the office for set pieces like team bonding, for training, and for going out to clients for specific jobs. Perhaps not 5 days a week, perhaps maybe 1 day or 2 days or 3 days in the week. So in terms of my own study, could audit be done from home? Yes. Could any part of the audit, is there any part of the audit function that couldn't be done from home? Not really. So does increased home working really widen the talent pool for audit firms? So that's where I want to take the next stage of my research. It does present opportunities for women auditors with family commitments. It does present opportunities for women who take career breaks, because home working is more acceptable in an industry where it absolutely wasn't before. And obviously there are opportunities for others, the disabled and perhaps carers. And of course it comes with challenges, as I highlighted in my previous slide. So I think that's pretty much all I want to say at the moment, and I'd be happy to take any questions later. Thank you. Back to you, Tessa.
Thank you very much, Suki. I think you've fulfilled the brief excellently there, in that you raised some of the benefits for a sector that previously wasn't very keen on the idea of home working and has had to think about it, and your findings show that it's eminently possible. But you've also raised some of the challenges, which I hope some of the other speakers will take up. So thank you very much for that. And now I'm just going to introduce Claire McCartney, who is the Senior Policy Advisor for Resourcing and Inclusion at the Chartered Institute of Personnel and Development. So she specialises in diversity, inclusion, flexible working and resourcing. And she's developed guidance around compassionate bereavement support, workplace carers, creating menopause-friendly workplaces, domestic abuse, workplace support and age diversity, and has worked on a range of international projects. She has also presented many articles and reports at conferences and seminars. She also has run her own research and consultancy organisation and was a principal researcher at Roffey Park, where she conducted research projects into a variety of topics, including work-life balance, flexible working, employee volunteering, talent management and diversity. So Claire, please tell us about what the CIPD work in this area is. Thank you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Tessa. Really delighted to be contributing to this workshop on the important issue of the equality impacts of home working. Great to also hear from Suki there as an opener, and really interesting to hear about kind of a deep dive into the auditing profession. And as you said, one that's not commonly associated with flexible working and home working. So I think lots of the opportunities and the challenges that you raised actually are mirrored in some of our kind of organisational findings coming through from the CIPD. So what I wanted to do was to focus on 3 areas with you this afternoon. So first of all, I wanted to share some of the findings on the impact of the pandemic on organisational approaches to inclusion and diversity. I then wanted to take a closer look at CIPD findings around home working and flexible working, and to get into the detail around the challenges and the opportunities presented in relation to equality. And then I wanted to finish off by sharing some useful practices and resources for organisations to support wider inclusion and diversity. So let's focus on the first issue, which is what are some of the findings on the impact of the pandemic on organisational approaches to inclusion and diversity generally? So our employer survey, which was conducted in June and sampled just over 1,000 employers, shows that organisations are continuing to prioritise inclusion and diversity. 62% reject the notion that work on inclusion and diversity has to go on the back burner for now. And a further 65% maintain that their organisation has explicitly considered the needs and also the likely concerns of different employee groups throughout the pandemic. And I think while more clearly needs to be done to increase inclusion and diversity within organisations, the survey results reflect the growing awareness that the health of many groups are and have been disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, and many groups with protected characteristics. And serious attention needs to be paid to the safety of workers in the physical workspace now and in the future. We're responding to a number of different consultations, government consultations at the moment relating to this, including the consultation on ethnic disparities and inequality in the UK, and also the government's National Strategy for Disabled People, and the consultation, DWP consultation and review of disability confident as well. But I think apart from the direct health concerns, we also know that certain groups of workers are likely to be more disadvantaged by our worsening labour market. Resolution Foundation research suggests that young people are more likely to have lost work or seen their income drop because of the pandemic, and older workers fear being impacted by involuntary redundancies. Research from the Institute of Fiscal Studies and UCL back in May showed that gender inequalities are also accentuated, and particularly for working mothers. And the findings showed that mothers are more likely than fathers to have left paid work since February, And among mothers and fathers who are still in paid work or were at that point, mothers have seen a bigger proportional reduction in hours of work than fathers. In addition, BEIS government evidence suggests that discrimination faced by pregnant women and new mothers before the pandemic was high, and that is likely to be accentuated further by the pandemic. And again, at the CIPD, we're supportive of the government's proposal to extend redundancy protection by 6 months after a mother has returned to work. So hopefully that kind of gives an overview for the first section. I'd like to move on now to look at our findings specifically around home working and flexible working. And our survey data suggests that employers expect the number of staff working from home in the future to double in comparison to pre-pandemic levels. And clearly, you know, we've seen one of the biggest home working experiments in the UK. It's opened up mindsets about the possibility of home working. And our research with employers shows that productivity levels on the whole have remained constant throughout this period. Home workers have benefited from greater work-life balance, as Suki mentioned, fewer distractions, and even coming through from our survey, greater collaboration and surprisingly, IT upskilling as well. And home working can certainly be helpful for a range of different reasons, and you know, those that have caring responsibilities, both childcare but also elder care responsibilities potentially, and also those with disabilities and long-term health conditions. Yeah, I think it's really important to say that this isn't home working in normal times. You know, this has very much been enforced home working, and many people have been dealing with additional pressures and anxieties relating to the pandemic, and also for some, working from home may not be a safe option. So we have launched some guidance with the Equality and Human Rights Commission around supporting employees experiencing domestic abuse. We know that women are more likely to be impacted by domestic abuse, and disabled women in particular twice as likely as other women to experience domestic abuse. So I think it's also worth mentioning that there are concerns for the mental health and well-being of LGBT+ workers as well, potentially distanced from supportive communities and allies in the physical workspaces when working from home. I think it's also important to say that just because many of us are working from home, that doesn't necessarily mean that we are working flexibly. We could still have, you know, a real rigidity in the hours that we're working. There could be work intensification going on there. We know that often people work longer hours when they're working from home, and those boundaries between home and work become blurred. I think it's therefore crucial that physical and mental well-being of all employees are really properly supported, including making provision for those for whom working from home is unsuitable. So more employers are likely in the future to adopt a hybrid mixture of home and workplace working, and this can certainly be positive. It can support greater flexibility and work-life balance, and it mirrors employee demand coming through from our employee survey. And our review of the home working evidence suggests that actually, if you're working on a partial basis from home, on a voluntary basis, then that can actually really support good quality jobs. But it's worth mentioning that there is a potential danger here, and that that's the need to avoid the creation of a two-tiered workforce. So those that are, you know, present and visible in the office and therefore might be getting more opportunities, more development, more career progression, and those who by choice, or often actually in the current circumstances by necessity, are working from home and are much less visible. And then I think the other point to consider is, how about those that aren't able to work from home at all? So research conducted in June by the Welsh Institute of Social and Economic Research, for instance, shows the surge in home working triggered by the lockdown in the UK was experienced most strongly by the highest paid, the better qualified, the highest skilled, and those living in London and the South East. And it's often our essential workers and our lower paid frontline staff who aren't able to work from home. And it's crucial that these workers aren't left behind when we think about flexible working more generally. And that's why at the CIPD we're calling on the government to make the right to request flexible working a day one right for all employees, and also to strengthen the business reasons for rejecting flexible working requests, because we think that this will really open up opportunities for those that can't work from home, and really help to support greater fairness and equality going forward. So the third area that I wanted to conclude with is just talking about some useful practices and resources for organisations to support inclusion and diversity. So first of all, I'd flag the Equality and Human Rights guidance around making sure that we are applying non-discriminatory practice in our decision making around things like furloughing, redundancy, short-term working, and the EHRC have updated their guidance on this, and it's a useful tool for organisations, and they cover things like redundancy procedures and selection criteria, and also pregnant women and those on maternity leave, and making reasonable adjustments for disabled workers. I think it's really helpful, as I've been talking about, to try to support wider flexibility. So, you know, to think much more creatively about a flexible working, such as job shares, compressed hours, flexible start and finish times, for instance, and making use of pilots can be really helpful for employers. We certainly found that with some of the organisations that we've worked with, and as we said, this has been a pilot period in some respects, but actually trying things out, learning and developing can be really helpful and support positive change. And then I think it's about building inclusion within our organisations, in our work practices and our cultures. So it's about thinking about designing your work practices to suit all of your locations. So making sure that your work processes support both home workers and conventionally sighted employees, that you're concentrating on things like knowledge sharing, coordination of work, task-related communications, team relationships to really encourage performance and innovation. And for home workers, it's really important to make sure that they have access to online risk assessments, that they've got appropriate physical space, equipment, accessibility, that they're following your data protection procedures, and also importantly that they have any reasonable adjustments that they need. Training and supporting line managers, really pivotal to manage and support people inclusively. And I think here this is around the principles of good people management. So making sure that line managers are holding regular one-to-ones with their employees to discuss any work issues, but also any personal concerns that they may have currently. Making any reasonable adjustments that are needed at home or in the physical workspace, setting clear objectives, and managing by outputs rather than inputs, really, really important. And role modelling flexibility as well. So I think it's great if line managers can talk about their own flexible pattern and share that with team members, and that will help to create kind of a norm around flexible working. And then finally, I think it's really important to keep a spotlight on development and career progression for all. You know, as we heard in that potential danger of the two-tiered workforce, we want to make sure that everyone has opportunities around career progression and development. So it's about having ongoing career conversations with your employees, making sure that you have fair allocation of work and opportunities. If you have any training, making sure that you're recording it so that flexible workers are able to catch up on it. And then I think it's about thinking about enhancing and maintaining the visibility of hybrid and home workers. So providing things like opportunities to chair meetings, to lead on work streams, to conduct virtual presentations, just helping to support that visibility in the workspace. So hopefully that's given you an overview of the areas that I wanted to share, and I'm going to hand back over to Tessa now for any comments or questions that are coming through in the chat.
Great, Claire, thank you very much. That was a fascinating view, and some really important points raised there. particularly thought your point about how homework isn't necessarily flexible work was a really important one to remember. And also your concerns about the two-tier workforce and what impact that could have on people who are only able to work at home and their sort of promotion prospects and things. So I think those are all really important things to watch. So we have some questions. So we've now got about 10 minutes for questions. I'm going to take a couple which are directed specifically at Suki about auditing. So Hydranor asked whether how homeworking influenced trust building between the auditor and the clients. And we have another one. Is it gone? Is it gone? We had one also directed at Suki, which was to do. I can't find it.
Status.
Suki, answer the one I just asked you because I've lost the other one.
Okay. So one is to do with trust building between the client and the auditor. Well, I did ask actually, because when I talk to participants, obviously one of the key things when auditors collect evidence is that it has to be, you have to be certain of validity, reliability of the evidence. And I did say to them, when you screen share, or when a client is uploading documents, how can you be certain of the validity and the reliability of those documents? So obviously when conducting audit tests, you don't just use, you look at alternative sources of evidence as well. So many of the participants that responded said they felt that validity and reliability hadn't been an issue in terms of trusting the client to upload, real documents, because there were other sources that they could have looked at as well. So that didn't seem to come across as a big concern for any of the participants. The other question that was asked, which was about status, I think. Does the status of the professional auditor change because they might be offering a cheaper service if people work from home? Again, the status of the profession, is sourced from a number of, comes from a number of sources. It isn't just to do with the price of the audit. And I think I can probably honestly say it won't be that much cheaper. I'm sure there will be a way of, recouping fees. So it's a really interesting question. My gut feeling is probably no, because of all the other sources of status that the profession has.
Thanks, Suki. The other question, I found it. So this was about the productivity in achieving deadlines on audits.
Yes.
I wonder whether that was.
Yes, I did ask about that actually. So one of the questions was, were you working as, how many hours did you used to work regularly before lockdown on your jobs, and how many hours are you working now? And I agree with what Claire said, actually. Many people were working more hours. Perhaps it was because I was asking them, in April, in March, when they were just getting used to working from home and sort of getting the gist of it. But many people said that they were working more hours. Some people said that they carried on working because there was no disconnect between leaving the office and coming home. Normally there would be a journey in between that would disconnect them from work. So some of them said that they would carry on working maybe much later than they normally would. Although others said, I definitely won't work any weekends, and I stop work at 6 o'clock, which is the same time I stop for work. Productivity was another issue. Some people said they were a lot more productive at home because they didn't have the interruptions if they were living on their own or just with a partner. Others, those with family commitments, were possibly less productive because they had homeschooling to deal with and young children at home. So productivity is, I guess, in the experience of this study, is related to your personal situation. Those who didn't have as many distractions felt that they were far more productive working from home. Thanks,
Suki. Let me take a couple more questions which I think Claire might want to respond to. Anne Galpin has said, when workplaces transition to a situation of some working remotely and some in person, this blend of remote and on-site working has some accessibility and health and safety considerations for disabled and other workers. So how do you ensure that the innovation and lessons learned during the lockdown continue to be put into practice and improved on? I think that's going to be an important one.
It is. I mean, and such a good question. I hate to use that awful phrase, build back better, but I think it is absolutely around learning from the situation that we're in, and that some of the things that have worked much better potentially for people with disabilities and long-term health conditions. I've seen a recent Unison survey which suggests that I think 73% of disabled workers feel that they're more or just as productive as they were before, and they're much less fatigued, experiencing much less pain because of their not having to commute, and also being able to take more breaks and start the day later as well. So I think there's quite a lot of learning in that already, in terms of if we're having this hybrid approach and we're in the physical workspace, we need more flexibility in terms of the way that people are working, in terms of the breaks that we're accommodating people, because that will enhance their their performance and their well-being. But also in that same survey, those who were less productive, more than half of them weren't being given any reasonable adjustments to work from home. So which is a legal responsibility. So we need to learn from these lessons. We need to, as organisations, we need to speak to our employees. We need to speak to our disabled employees with long-term health conditions. We need to ask them about the adjustments that would make the most difference for them in the working from home, but also in the physical workspace, and really start to apply some of those lessons.
Thanks, Claire. Another question from Hydron, which I think you might be able to discuss. So how about knowledge sharing when working mainly from home? So tacit knowledge, what kind of, how have managers dealt with that issue about making sure people do have that sort of informal exchange of knowledge when they're working?
Yeah. I think knowledge sharing is one of the challenges of working virtually, and I think certainly at the beginning, but we have been adapting our processes. And I think if you have a supportive line manager that's thinking about introducing opportunities, such as like drop-in coffee events where you can just catch up with your colleagues and have that kind of informal the kind of informal chats that you would do in the workplace, but also some more kind of formal, regular conversations as well, I think are needed, particularly if people, are suffering from social isolation and, those sorts of opportunities. And actually our survey research said that actually home working had brought benefits of greater collaboration, which I think is really interesting. So, but again, I think that would depend on how supportive your team is, how supportive your line manager is, what access you have to different technology and platforms, because some of those can really help to aid collaboration in the virtual world.
Thank you very much, Claire. I think we'll stop on questions for now. We will have another session for questions at the end. So some of you whose questions we haven't been able to answer, we might be able to take those at the end. I know Claire won't be able to stay to the end. So before I introduce the next speaker, I shall say thank you very, very much, Claire, for coming along.
Thank you.
Presentation, really fascinating. And I hope we can continue to keep discussing these issues in some forum or other. That was really, really helpful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'll now introduce Abigail. Abigail Marks is, as of this beginning of this month, she's Professor of Future of Work at Newcastle University Business School. Before that, she was Professor of Work and Employment at Stirling Management School and the Associate Dean of Business Engagement. Her research focuses on identity, the technology sector, and the relationship between work and social class. She's published in a wide range of journals, including Sociology, Work, Employment and Society, Human Relations, British Journal of Industrial Relations, and Gender, Work and Organisation. And she's currently a principal investigator on a UKRI ESRC COVID project, looking at working at home under COVID, which is what she's now going to tell us about. Thank you very much, Abigail.
No problem. Okay, I think I'm about to become the voice of doom and gloom, so I'm really, really sorry about that. If I'm slightly more pessimistic. But thank you very much for introducing me, and I'm really, really delighted to be involved in this. And the other two contributions so far have been great, really, really interesting. As you said, Tessa, I'm part of a working at home project. There is 4 of us currently working on the project. So there's myself, Danny, who's the researcher, Oliver, who is still at Stirling, and Leela, who's at the University of Edinburgh. And we are really, really lucky to have a really, really great opportunity to look at home working. So I'll just give a quick overview about the sort of data we have, the data we're collecting, just to help put what I'm going to say into a little bit of context. So the project itself will involve 3 surveys. We've undertaken 1 survey, which was just under 1,500 people. That was undertaken in June, July this year. We're currently involved in doing the 2nd survey, and the 3rd survey will go out probably late spring. We also have a panel of participants, of 80 participants, who we are interviewing 4 times within the next year. So we've completed the 2nd phase of interviews. The participants are across the UK. They transact different groups in terms of ethnicity, gender, which was a bit of a challenge because it's the sort of thing women volunteer for more than men, and occupational groups. And as I said, we've done 2 sets of interviews, so we've got between about 200 hours of interviews so far with people that are working from home. The last interviews finished a couple of weeks ago, so we're really able to see home working from the start of the pandemic to where we are now. The other thing I would like to say before I go on to talk a bit about the findings is that the majority of people that are home working under COVID measures are not that dissimilar to your typical home worker. So they tend to earn slightly higher than average hourly wage. So they are, to a large extent, not entirely, but to a large extent, you get a relatively privileged group of workers. So not unanimously, because we had some very challenged people in our participant group, but they are generally a relatively privileged group. So to start off with, I'd like to give you a quick quote by somebody, a man that worked in local government, which I think clearly demonstrates how things may have started changing between when we did the 1st interview and the 2nd interview. And he says, "I think to begin, we were working far, far more hours," and this was reflected by the other speakers and indeed the majority of our participants. "But I feel now we're in a 2nd phase. The initial phase was completely unsustainable, but it was just something that had to be done." So it was very clear that to start off with, people were working ridiculously long hours. But in terms of generally how we found people were coping with home working, say about half the people we spoke to, half the people that responded to the survey reported to being quite well overall, although about 1 in 3 reported quite poor well-being with home working. Women, unsurprisingly, because of the responsibilities that they had, or more often had reported poorer well-being than men, and particularly women that had children of school age. Turning that on the head, however, one of the big advantages of home working was that people did feel they got to spend more time with their children, and this we found both during lockdown measures when the children were at home, but also since children have gone back to school, parents are still feeling the benefit of spending more time with their children. And interestingly, I was talking to one woman who is a very senior person within the finance sector, and she said for the first time in her entire career, she had been able to show that she had children. So beforehand, nobody ever knew she had children. She kept it very hidden. But obviously, as we all know, children have appeared on Zoom meetings. Her children did the same. She felt now she was actually allowed to put in her diary that she was picking up her children from school. And she was hoping, as somebody senior, as a senior woman in the company, that sort of experience was allowed to then diffuse down the company. So hopefully it would be a positive thing in terms of the way that women with children were seen within the organisation. As reflects the other speakers, we found that over 50% of employees had increased their working hours during the first lockdown. From interviewing for our second round of interviews, and again, it's 80 people, it's pretty reasonable. We have found that working hours are still higher than they were pre-lockdown, but less than they were in, say, March, April, May. That's partly to do with increased work demands. Over half people felt constantly under strain, and 50% found a very clear blurring between work and life. And one of the key things that we have found is the biggest problem is to do with the management of the pace of work. So, as somebody was saying, this missing commute, and it's something that I found really interesting, is this missing commute is part of the natural ebb and flow of the working day. Similarly, talking to people after meetings, having a coffee with people, some decompression activities, and all these activities actually reduce the intensity of the working day. And it was very difficult for people to replace that within a home working scenario. There was also the perception that there were a lot of unnecessary Zoom meetings, that people didn't feel that they could pick up the phone to call colleagues because it was invading their personal domain rather than being able to phone somebody up in another office. So there's some really interesting findings in terms of the ebb and flow of the working day has changed, and that really has had a negative impact on stress and strain. Looking at it, let's look at looking at life-work balance as opposed to sort of work-life balance. The majority of our participants felt that their personal life did not actually have a negative impact on them when working from home, and that was both people with and without childcare responsibilities. But at least a third felt that their personal responsibilities did put a particular strain on their ability to work, and this was particularly of parents of children under 11. But again, this particular finding was very much the case when children were at home in the earlier stages of lockdown. What we also found is that there is some evidence that home crowdedness increases work-life conflict. Unsurprisingly, that the busier the house, the more demands there are on space, then the increase in conflict, particularly in terms of work and life. And that links to lower socioeconomic groups finding home working more challenging. So is home working going to provide better opportunities? An interesting one. So the original proponents of home working often view home working as a way of supporting those that most need the flexibility in terms of saving of time. So, for example, home working offers women, lone parents, and those with disabilities opportunities to better manage their work and well-being and non-work activities. But interestingly enough, it looks like those that work at home and those that can least afford the financial penalties may be the ones that are most subject to them. Women in particular take on what we have decided to call non-work but work burden for the household. This is sort of indirect performance of free labour. So, for example, buying travel tickets that are needed to travel to work, if you weren't working under a pandemic, preparing clothes, preparing lunches for all members of the household. Unfortunately, with people working from home, that is the bit that's been taken away from women. So in fact, they have, although childcare and other work responsibilities or non-work responsibilities have been increasing the burden, there are other things, the preparation for work when leaving the house, that have been removed. It's also, again, as other people have established, that it's well established that working from home comes with penalties, so the decreased promotion opportunities compared to those based in the office, and lower visibility. And unfortunately, what we've heard recently is, there's been mooted around, is all the, so for example, the Deutsche Bank economists saying that there should be increased taxation of those that are working from home, that people that choose to work from home should have a lower salary. Again, that was mooted by companies such as Twitter, Google, Facebook. And as it's women who are going to possibly benefit most from home working, then it's going to indirectly increase discrimination against women. So I think overall, I think we've got some really interesting findings. So there's some really positive There's some positive factors. Obviously, the opportunity to work remotely is predominantly linked to white-collar professional workers. And what worries me is this new policy focus on home working could increase already existing inequalities in the labour market. So, for example, the Welsh Government are saying that they want 30% of the Welsh population to be working at home. That is likely to, again, privilege white-collar office workers. So employees in lower socioeconomic groups, as we all know from the COVID statistics, are much more likely to have jobs that prevent home working, which is often why lower socioeconomic groups are more likely to get COVID, because they couldn't stay at home when as they were more likely to be working outside the office. And if you look at government statistics, C2DE workers, about 40% of them are not working at home, compared to 16% of ABC1 workers. So again, a massive focus on home working, particularly a policy focus on home working, may further increase the gap between the rich and the poor. And finally, I think as already been mentioned by a previous speaker, the good news is that home working clearly looks like it's going to have a good benefit for disabled workers. And as again was said before, 73% of disabled workers have reported being more or equally productive whilst working from home. And that was, as was said earlier, reported by Unison. And we certainly found with the workers with any disability that we have interviewed that there has been some benefit to working from home. Where there wasn't the benefit was parents who had disabled children, when working from home was really problematic for them because of the additional burdens placed on them in terms of childcare. Okay, so as I said, I'm sorry to be a bit of the voice of doom and gloom. I think there are some really, really good emancipatory opportunities. But apart from that, I think we have to be cautious moving forward. We're told this is an extreme event. It's an extreme scenario, and I think it's really important that we collect more data over time before we start making any radical changes in the location of work.
Thanks, Abigail. That's really, really interesting, and I think it's really important that we do look at the negative. You know, we look at the problems, and you know, the research that you're doing is, you know, countering the hype that, oh yes, we can all become home workers, and it's so important to be aware that different groups are not all going to experience this positively or in the same way. And of course,
so the other thing I've got to say is women are much more likely not to have a dedicated home working space than men. So men, if there's a man and a woman working at home, the women are much more likely to be on the kitchen table and the man in the home office.
Right, interesting.
So there's some interesting things going on. Yeah,
great. I'm sure there'll be lots of interesting questions that we can ask you to pick up on in a moment, but I'm going to ask Natasha Owusu, who's the TUC's Policy and Campaigns Support Officer. I'm delighted to introduce Natasha so we can have a perspective from the TUC and the trade unions. So she works in the Equality and Strategy Department at the TUC and has worked across various different departments for many years and worked on equality campaigns, including racism at work. She's worked in the Employment Rights Office, where she was involved in campaigning on migrant workers' rights. Currently, she's the lead on flexible working, campaigning for paid carers' leave, and conducting the TUC biennial equality audit, looking at how unions are promoting equality in their work, and has also worked in the TUC education department. So, Natasha, please give us your perspective from the trade unions.
Thank you. Thank you to the Centre for Research in Equality and Diversity, to the Chair, Tessa Wright, for inviting me here today. It is an honour for me to be speaking. I am the Policy and Campaign Support Officer in the Equality and Strategy Department at the TUC. At the TUC, we represent over 6 million working people in the UK. And along with our affiliated trade unions, we fight for equality in the workplace, whether that's fighting for proper minimum wage, challenging sexism, racism, homophobia, and ableism in the workplace. So this question that we are here to discuss is, does widespread home working offer equality benefits or entrench inequality? I have been invited to speak on this from the trade union's perspective of home working. The pandemic has forced governments and employers to change workplace culture around flexible working with enforced home working. TEC data prior to COVID found that people in working class jobs most likely to miss out on flexible working arrangements. 1 in 3 requests for flexible working were being turned down. The polling showed that flexible working is not available to many workers and that people in working class jobs are most likely to miss out on it. During the pandemic, we have heard of the benefits of working from home, which include being able to balance work and family responsibilities, improve well-being, less stress, not having to travel to work, increased motivation and productivity. We have seen an explosion of home working since the first lockdown in March. In October, data from the ONS showed that the number of people working exclusively from home rose from 21% to 24%. Official figures show exclusive remote working hit a high of 38% in mid-June, though the statistics were only collected from the middle of May, so miss out nearly 2 months of the lockdown. The results also indicate productivity among the majority of those working from home during lockdown remained stable or even improved compared to 6 months before. Whilst for employers, CIPD have reported that the shift to home working over the pandemic has been a positive experience for most employers, who report people's improved work-life balance, enhanced employee collaboration, and improved focus. A recent Mother Pucker report asked 1,420 employers from across the country how their working patterns had changed during the lockdown and what they plan to do next. The report found that working from home saw the biggest increase, with 72% of all employers reporting wanting to keep working from home, followed by an increase in compressed hours, flexi-time, part-time and job share. With a survey from working families highlighting that 9 in 10 working parents and carers want their workplace to retain flexible working post-COVID-19. We believe trade unions have an important role to play in working together with employers to ensure equal and fair access for all workers to flexible working, and to ensure we remove barriers and build momentum on the advantages of working from home. One of our unions, Unison, conducted an annual equality survey with over 8,000 responses. Home working was seen as one of the most pressing issues. During the pandemic, 45% of Unison members worked outside of their home from their usual workplace. 40% worked from home and the remainder were furloughed or on some form of leave. For those working from home, over 6 in 10 members felt there were no risk to their health, safety and well-being, and many members felt more productive working from home. But workers working outside the home are anxious about safety. For example, key workers. The number of people working from home varies dramatically by industry in a handful. The vast majority of staff have been working from home, but in many others, it's less than half. In accommodation and food sector, for example, just 14% were working from home. Compare that with the information and communicator sector, where it was 87%. Workers in the highest paid industry are also most likely to work from home, whilst those in sectors like accommodation and food earn less than the average. Unison's members surveyed raised concerns about technical equipment and communications. For some members, working from home was made difficult by challenges with IT systems that were not set up to support home working. Members reported there was inequity in access to IT and communications equipment, not having suitable equipment and not provided with any by the employer. And a member reported having to buy a new laptop, but still not having access to 3 essential work IT systems. One member stated not having access to emails. Unions have also told us about members' concern transitioning from office to working from home, lack of training for line managers on how to manage remote working, a skills gap, issues around blurred lines of working and home. Concern has been raised about presenteeism. You end up overproducing to make up for the fact that you are working from home. Some members raised concerns about their health and well-being. Over a quarter of respondents to Unison's survey felt working from home brought risks to their health and safety and well-being. One member living with an abusive partner said, "Before lockdown, I was just about coping as long as I was going into the office. But being kept at home and my children spending even more time with their abuser has almost broken me." The National Domestic Abuse Helpline had reported a 25% increase in calls since the coronavirus lockdown began, as well as a 150% increase in visits to their website. TUC are proposing employers should offer flexible working arrangements for survivors and a period of paid employment leave to support them to cope with and recover from their experiences. For LGBT+ workers, over half of workers said their mental health had been slightly or seriously affected by lockdown, rising to 70% amongst LGBT+ and young workers. Social isolation and loneliness was a driving factor. LGBT+ workers have told us that the pandemic has meant being isolated with those who are hostile and phobic towards them, including family and neighbours, with no ability to get away from them. And this has had a real impact on LGBT+ people's mental health. More than 2 million people have a work-related mental health problem, and 70% of union reps report stress as a top safety concern at work. We have also seen a rise in the number of employers encouraging workers to cope with stress. This is commonly called resilience. It is based on the idea that through training and personal development, we can be helped to bounce back from adversity to change. It believes employers just need to develop the ability to handle the demands placed on them better rather than tackling the causes of that stress. This is unfortunately the wrong approach. Employers should be protecting workers and create a safe working environment. Safe working environment that prevents workers from experiencing all forms of harassment and discrimination, and which reduces and manages the stress. The health, social, and economic impacts of COVID-19 are highly gendered. The economic and health impacts of this crisis are most acutely affecting key workers and those employed on insecure contracts in shut-down sectors. These workers are more likely to be women. Women are the vast majority of those working on the front line of the crisis. Women are the majority of workers with highest exposure to COVID-19. Women are more likely to be in low-paid jobs. Women are the majority of those providing care, whether paid or unpaid, doing 3 times more unpaid caring than men. 1 in 10 workers has started providing unpaid care since the outbreak. Many of the measures government have introduced to respond to COVID-19 have disproportionately impacted women. The closure of schools and childcare settings had an immediate impact on parents' working lives. For many women, being able to work from home on a flexible basis has allowed them to cope with school and childcare setting closures. Currently, parents have no right to paid parental leave or flexible working in order to help juggle their responsibilities. The outcome of shutting schools could have had a disastrous impact on women's working lives. However, the benefits haven't been equal across the workforce. Many women working as key workers outside the home are working at typical hours, trying to balance work with caring commitments, and in an environment where there are no childcare options outside of the normal 9 a.m. to 3 p.m. school day. This has particularly affected low-paid women. TUC research found 1 in 6 working mothers, mostly in low-paid jobs, said they had no choice but to reduce their working hours. TUC's survey also revealed that working mothers working from home still face challenges. 3 in 10 said they regularly worked early in the morning or late at night to balance work and childcare. The survey found that 1 in 6 women said they were worried that balancing work and childcare had affected how they would be assessed by their manager. And the same said they were worried that it had affected their chances of a promotion in the future. In contrast, when we spoke to mums working outside the home, they were unlikely to say their working hours had changed due to the pandemic. Those who were working more hours were paid for them. Many women make flexible working requests in pregnancy or on return to work from maternity leave. Prior to COVID-19, many new mothers had negative experiences around flexible working. During the pandemic, TUC poll of more than 3,400 women who have been pregnant or on maternity leave since the pandemic began found 1 in 4 pregnant women and new mums in our survey have experienced unfair treatment or discrimination at work, including being singled out for a redundancy or furlough. Pregnant women told the TUC they were required to take sick leave when they were not sick, to take unpaid leave, to start their maternity leave early, or to leave the workplace because their employer did not act to make their workplace safe for them. All of these actions are illegal. Pregnant key workers, many those on the lowest pay, have also reported being denied requests to work at home. Our report, Dying on the Job, looking at BME workers' experiences during the pandemic, found that throughout the crisis, BME workers have been singled out for higher risk work, denied access to PPE and appropriate risk assessments. And as we know, ONS figures have reported that Black men and Black women are 4.2 and 4.3 times respective more likely than white men and women to die from coronavirus. The report also highlighted a range of issues in relation to whether BME workers could work from home, how they were treated when they were there, and whether or not they were being furloughed. A number of respondents reported still having to come into work while white colleagues carrying out similar work were allowed to work from home or were furloughed. BME workers working from home reported experiencing unfair treatment from senior colleagues. Responses to our survey show some BME workers who are working from home have been put under increased scrutiny and surveillance. Some workers face not just extra scrutiny of their work, but extra scrutiny if they reported the need to work from home or call in sick. Some BME workers were being told to work from home, but left adrift and excluded once there. Whilst one journalist spoke about how just being checked in on would have been appreciated. BME women are overrepresented in insecure jobs. The impact insecure work has on BME women includes having not much control over the hours you work and also how often. The unpredictable working hours has an impact when organising childcare, care of older relatives, and even your social life. BME women in insecure work miss out on basic rights at work, such as the right to sick pay, flexible working, and protection from unfair dismissal. These workplace protections have been critical during the pandemic. Whilst for a long time, disabled workers have told us they've been denied home working as a reasonable adjustment when they've requested it. They have been told it would be impossible, but the pandemic turned that on its head, and suddenly disabled workers who had been denied home working and told it wasn't possible found it was and were forced to work at home. While we wouldn't say home working is right for all disabled workers, and workers should have a choice where this is concerned, there were clear and obvious benefits for our disabled members. This included reduced impact on pain and fatigue due to loss of less commuting and ability to work more flexibly with additional breaks or later start time. Those who are shielding many disabled workers have also been able to work from home. However, some in this position are only set up to do so on a temporary basis. Their homes are now their place of work, and the medium term, they will need changes to their home to enable them to continue to working there. Colleagues have also touched on Unison's survey findings around disabled members. 79% of disabled members who work from home said that they were more or as productive as a result of the benefits listed above. A number of disabled workers reported taking less sickness absence as they were able to manage their conditions better than working from home. That's why the TUC recommended that disabled workers who were able to work from home during the crisis should be legally entitled to continue to do so permanently, and why Unison recommended a new enforcement right to home working for disabled workers who want it, with clear deadlines for response from employers and for implementation. What do we want to see? We believe all workers should have a day one legal right to work flexibly, and all jobs should be advertised as flexible. We have a significant opportunity to lay the foundations for flexible working for many generations to come, but this needs to be done equally and fairly. Not all workers will want to return to the office, and not all workers will want to continue working from home. Trade unions believe home working is a bargaining issue, and employers should ensure that any policies introduced are not enforced on workers, and that they work with trade unions to achieve agreements on home working policies. I'll hand over to Tessa now. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Natasha. That was great. That was really interesting. And I think it's very good to hear that the TUC is calling for day one rights to flexible working. So and interesting that the CIPD is also calling for the same thing. So let's hope that's something that there might be some progress on. And can I just say as well, thank you to all of your speakers for your brilliant timekeeping. I didn't know you all did exactly what I asked you to do. It was really good. So it's made my job as a chair much easier. So we now do have 15 minutes for some questions. I want to start with one So people, please do add in any other questions, but we had one from Della Lucas, who said, could you estimate racial or ethnic gaps in the quality of home working? I don't know whether anyone knows the answer to that, but I think it'd be really interesting if we, if you do have any information on the sort of disparity in terms of home working.
No, we don't have any figures on that, but we're planning to do a survey of our reps as part of my work on the equality audit. Every 4 years we conduct a survey of our reps to find out what equality issues they're tackling in the workplace, and we're hoping to gather more information in regards to home working and flexible working from our unions on that as well.
Okay, that does sound like it, because several of you have made the point that there are people in kind of poorer conditions clearly finding it harder to work at home and overcrowded conditions. So I do think it's important that we also know how that affects BME workers.
We couldn't find any, I mean, we haven't so far found any difference, but as I said, a lot of home workers are relatively privileged. Saying it all, and I think, so therefore, the low socioeconomic groups that are represented and BME workers, it's difficult to unpick it all because there's so many factors at play. But we're doing a second survey, and it's certainly something we will be looking at in more detail for the second survey.
Thanks, Abigail. We have a question from Anne Galpin, who's asked about, who said that disabled trade union members are reporting difficulties in persuading employers to transfer their agreed adjustments to home working. How can we deal with these issues? And I thought that was interesting because, you know, there have been comments about how it might be easier for disabled workers to work at home. But of course, if you've got workplace adjustments that have been things that have been put in your office or things that your employer is paying for, are they then going to pay for those things at home? And perhaps if I can add on to that question, a sort of wider issue about, you know, are you finding that employers are actually footing the bill for the technology and maybe heating bills and all the other things that workers are having to pay for? And that idea of lower salaries for people working at home just seems utterly outrageous when there are obviously going to be more costs that workers are bearing. So, so first of all, the question about disabled workers, particularly in relation to workplace adjustments, and then a wider issue about are employers paying the costs for home working? Who would like to start?
We don't have any particular data. Again, we've got few interviews with disabled workers, and so we don't have the bigger picture. What we do know is that a lot of organisations are being great in terms of providing equipment. So they are allowing pickup of desks, chairs, second monitors, they're delivering them home. However, there are a lot of other organisations that are still allowing people to work on ironing boards. I mean, we've seen some horrors. So all our interviews were on videos, so we saw where people were working. And there have been some absolute horrors with literally people working from ironing boards, people working in the garage, and organisations not supporting that. The worst, quite tragically, the people that we've had, it's not a particularly large number in our sample, but universities have been possibly the worst at providing equipment when asked. But other public sector organisations have been pretty good, but there has been a real mix. But there's certainly, in the first round of interviews, I would say we're talking 50, 60, 70% going, oh, my back. You know, there were a lot of I'm not an expert on musculoskeletal problems, but there was certainly a lot of reporting of poor workstations because people hadn't been provided the equipment. Virtually nobody was being given an allowance for heating or lighting at home. People weren't being given printers. There was a lot of things that were not making the working environment necessarily appropriate or optimum. And this thing about people being given lower salaries and taxation, it's just outrageous. I mean, it's just horrific.
Yeah. Thanks, Abigail. Natasha, have you got any comments on the issue of what employers are providing?
In regards to reasonable adjustments, what unions are telling us is that disabled workers are struggling to get their reasonable adjustments put in place. When lockdown began, you know, due to enforced home working, disabled workers some disabled workers supported their employer and just got on with things. But as time went by, in regards to employers putting in place reasonable adjustments, it's been a challenge for members to get their reasonable adjustments. Unions have been working with employers and supporting members to get their reasonable adjustments put in. In regards to workplace equipment, regarding home working, as I stated in my speech, you know, members are struggling to get basic equipment put in place. Some members are going to the extreme as to buying their own equipment. So all of these issues are why the trade union and the TUC are looking at it from a bargaining perspective when talking about working from home issues, and also working from home, as colleagues have stated, is just one form of flexible working. Even though you're working from home, you still need other forms of flexible working put in place to balance childcare responsibilities, to be able to manage your disability as well. So it's really important that we look at it from that negotiating, bargaining perspective. And employers should work with employees and trade unions to put policies in place that supports everybody, and I think that is definitely the way for employers to go.
Thank you, Natasha. We have a comment from Debbie Foster, who has pointed out that they did some research. I hate the way these questions jump around. They did some research on disabled lawyers' experiences of home working, and you can find it on legallydisabled.com. It's by Foster and Hurst. I think that might be another interesting piece of research. In a moment, I'll try and put that in the chat. And there was another question from Maria Adamson, who was wondering if Abigail could say a bit more about gender differences around home working, so men's experience, as positive or negative.
It's difficult to say. It's actually quite difficult to generalise. It's also, there's a massive variation between lockdown and how people are responding now. So at the beginning of lockdown, everybody was really quite positive about it because they knew that it had been imposed on them. They did with whatever situation they were put under. Towards the end, people were getting, you know, they had really interesting exercise regimes. They were really into looking at nature, some really, really interesting stories about people's walks. Now, the real picture is coming out. I think men are having a slightly better experience because, as I said, in a household where two people are home working, they're much more likely to, or significantly more likely to get their own home working space. I think, like everybody, and I think like other speakers have said, people are missing the social aspects of work. But I think it's going to be really problematic having a blended model, because one of the things that obviously is not central to what's being discussed today, but something we need to be aware of, is the environmental impact. And having a blended model is fine, but heating a whole office building when you've only got a small proportion of the workforce going in, and there's some interesting research coming out about the environmental impact of home working compared to going into the office. And it's not just about the commute, it's about heating a whole house. is worse than heating an office and air conditioning and various other factors. Sorry, I seem to have gone off on a tangent on that one now. But I think one of the things I think we've been mindful of is making really sort of recommendations about blended working and how it should be undertaken, because there are so many other factors that need to be taken into account, and really the environmental impact of home working needs to be carefully considered.
Actually, Tessa, if I may say,
Suki, yeah.
I know the question was about gender and the differences between men and women. Actually, I found from my conversations that there's also differences between younger workers and older people. So people who have family responsibilities or caring responsibilities, you know, are very much more in favour of working from home more often compared with younger people who perhaps were living with their parents, work, you know, at home with their parents or at home with siblings or whatever, and they were far more keen to get back into the office. And in fact, for this profession, for auditing, many of them had joined for that very reason, that they wanted to travel. They wanted the opportunity to travel to different parts of the world through work. They wanted the opportunity to, you know, work in a team, socialize, and you know, weren't all that keen on home working much more in the future. So there's an old young divide as well, I think.
Thanks, Suki. Yeah, yeah. A final question, which I will put to you from Rachel Verdin, who said, I found the comment on lack of decompression activities interesting. Was there any evidence of employees attempting to address this problem? And perhaps again, you could sort of consider that in relation to wider issues of, you know, not imposing too many additional Zoom meetings on people. So it's not, you know, then they don't, it doesn't add to overwork as well. But how to resolve the lack of decompression time?
People, in terms of decompression time, some people, certainly not everybody, were managing to replace the commute with activities. So people would go for a walk before they started the working day. There was a really nice interview with a woman who was a low-paid worker with a very disabled child, who said the first thing she did before she started working was get a cup of coffee and sit in the garden. So when I interviewed her again 2 weeks ago, I said, I take it you're still not doing that. She said, oh no, I'm doing that, I'm just putting my coat on. And she was using that as her decompression activity. People taking the dog for a walk at lunchtime, sitting down, having lunch with their partners. Where people weren't managing the decompression activities was during work periods. And there were very few people that had come up with reasonable ways of doing that. And I think it's more of an ebb and flow. So the usual ebb and flow of the working days disappeared, and it's really, really quite intense now. And I think there needs to be, going forward, some management and recommendations in terms of the use of Zoom meetings or online meetings, because as I said, people weren't picking up the phone when they would normally phone somebody else's office because they're worried about invading their domestic space. And people aren't, you know, having a quick catch up after a meeting. I mean, occasionally people would make a quick phone call to somebody or send text messages during meetings, but it's not the same because people were sort of bang, 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 one meeting to another because they felt that they could do it because they're only in their home space. And I think serious recommendations need to be made about that, because that is where the stress is occurring. That, and obviously people logging in the evenings because the home space and the workspace are less differentiated, and we've all done that, but I think it's got worse.
Thanks, Abigail. It is just gone 5:30, but if Natasha and Suki have any final points you wish to make, that would be great.
I'll just finish off by just reiterating what I was saying. For trade unions welcome the opportunity to work with employers and for employers to be working with employees to put policies in place that are equal and fair and accessible to everybody, and also for employers to be for workers who are not able to work from home to also have equal access to flexible working options as well, because trade unions have told us about the challenges those workers face accessing other forms of flexible working.
Thank you. Yeah, really important. Yeah. Suki, did you have anything?
Well, I looked at a very sort of niche group compared with the other speakers. So the challenges are quite specific to this group. But you know, the thing that I would say, the thing that I took away from my interviews was the willingness to accept far greater flexibility and home working in this particular industry, where really, you know, it's not something that was ever really commonplace or accepted. In fact, as one of the other speakers said, very much looked down upon. You know, and said people who did flexible working in these in offices were you know, disadvantaged in many ways. So it's a huge shift for this particular industry.
Yeah. So thank you, Suki, and thank you all. So thank you to the participants. And I'd just like to say that at one point there were 100 of us listening to this call. So I think that at least one thing we have demonstrated is that having online meetings, so working remotely in the sense of having meetings in this way rather than at Queen Mary, has shown that many more of you are able to attend, because I'm sure it would have been more difficult for you all to kind of come to Queen Mary to hear a similar talk. So thank you so much to everyone who's attended, and also the speakers. Absolutely fantastic, really, really interesting contributions, very thoughtful views on the topic that I'm sure we're going to carry on talking about for a long time ahead. And do please keep an eye on our CRED blogs, where we will continue to talk about these issues, and we'll obviously link to work that Abigail's doing, that the Natasha and the TUC are doing, and also CIPD. So we'll make sure we kind of keep these links going and continue the discussion. So thank you all very, very much.